How is it going, guys? Today we are working on the WRX and we're gonna be installing some aftermarket sway bars. These are the brand new, just released Race Comp Engineering sway bars for the VB WRX. We're gonna be installing both the front and the rear, but before I show you how to install them, let's talk about why you'd want to install aftermarket sway bars in the first place. What's wrong with the ones that come on the car? Well, technically, there's nothing wrong with these stock sway bars. However, making changes to them allows us to dial in the handling characteristics. So to better understand this, let's do a quick crash course on what a sway bar actually does. Their main purpose is to reduce body roll when cornering, and they also allow you to change the understeer and oversteer characteristics of the car. Now, the way they reduce body roll is by being connected to the suspension components on both sides of the car. So for example, the rear sway bar in the WRX sits right above me here. This end is connected to the lower control arm of the driver's side, and the other end is connected to the passenger side. So let's say the suspension on the driver's side gets compressed and that wheel moves up closer to the body. That creates an upwards force on this end of the sway bar, which is then transferred to the other end. Let's head back over the table. I'll try to give you guys a better visual. So again, this is the rear WRX sway bar, and you can see as I lift up one end, the other end comes up with it. Pretty simple, there's nothing magical happening here. What this does when cornering is help to level out the car and reduce the amount of weight that's transferred to the outside tires, because the more even the weight distribution is on all four tires, the better your handling is gonna be. Now I mentioned oversteer and understeer characteristics, so let's talk a little bit about that. You can manipulate your sway bars to help reduce understeer or reduce oversteer. All-wheel drive cars like the WRX have a tendency to understeer, and that's because you're asking the front tires not only to corner and brake, but also accelerate. And they only have a certain amount of grip to give, so asking them to accelerate on top of all that makes it really easy to break the threshold of grip when you're cornering, which causes understeer. To help reduce understeer, what we can do is get a stiffer rear sway bar or a softer front sway bar. And to reduce oversteer, it's the opposite. You want a stiffer front sway bar or a softer rear sway bar, and that's kind of the basic methodology. Our new Race Comp Engineering rear sway bar is 22 millimeters thick, and it's 56 to 104% more stiff. It's adjustable, so there's 3 different mounting locations on the end, so you can adjust how stiff it is. The front is 24 millimeters thick, and it's 15 to 39% more stiff with 2 holes for adjustment. Now, I just told you to help reduce understeer, we should go with a softer front sway bar. So why are we gonna be installing a sway bar that's more stiff? Well, if you were paying attention to the numbers I just gave you, the rear sway bar at its stiffest setting is 104% more stiff, while the front is just 39% more stiff. So we still have a significantly more stiff rear sway bar to help reduce understeer. On top of that, we don't want an overly soft front sway bar on these cars with the McPherson strut design, because the more that front suspension is compressed, the more camber and grip we lose during cornering. So the stiffer front sway bar is gonna help even out that weight transfer and maintain our optimal camber settings. Now, my head hurts from all this technical stuff, so let's just get these installed. We're gonna start with the rear first because it's the easier out of the two. The front is a little bit more complicated, so we're just gonna deal with that later once my head's recovered from all that stuff that I just spewed out. We're working over on the passenger side. You're gonna wanna look for the end link that connects your sway bar to the lower control arm. There's gonna be a 14 millimeter nut holding it in place. So I've got a ratcheting wrench on the nut. And then I've also got a 4 millimeter hex key that I'm gonna insert into the stud so that it doesn't spin while I'm trying to break this nut free. All right, let's see if this gives us any issues. Same thing on the driver's side. On either side, near the corners, you're gonna see the silver sway bar mount brackets that are held in place by 2 12 millimeter bolts, one on the back and one on the front that we'll need to remove. With all the nuts and bolts out, we should be able to grab the sway bar and slide it out from underneath the car. Before we install our new sway bar, we need to lubricate the polyurethane bushing. There's a slot right here we could use to remove the bushing from the sway bar. And there's also a packet of lubricant that is included. So put on some gloves, or if you don't care, you can just use your fingers. Open this packet up. Now you don't need an excessive amount. We really just need a light coating on the inside of the bushing, and then just remove any excess with a paper towel so it doesn't get everywhere and make a mess. And then we can reinstall this on the sway bar. There we go. Do that to all of the bushings, and then we can install this on the car. You are going to want to transfer over those silver brackets onto the new bushings before you slide this into place. Of course, having aftermarket exhaust on the car might make things a little bit more difficult, but we got it figured out. So reuse the OEM bolts to get it mounted back up to the subframe, and then we can reinstall the end links. Here's a tip if you're ever installing suspension components, whether it's lowering springs, coilovers, sway bars, or lower control arms. Usually you want to have whatever end of the car you're working on, both of the wheels off of the ground with the suspension unloaded, so that you're not fighting against one end of the sway bar being loaded and trying to transfer over to the other side. I see people posting on the groups all the time about the holes of their coilover not lining up with the end link, and that's because they have one side of the car on the ground and the other side off of the ground. So just a tip, something to keep in mind to make your life a little bit easier when the time comes. I'm gonna be using the middle hole on these. I don't wanna go too crazy, so we're just gonna go in between the 56 and the 104%. But if we need to change it, we can easily do so later on. All right, now I just need to tighten everything down, and then we can move to the front. Underneath the front of the car, there's a couple things that we need to remove before we can take the sway bar off. The first being this plastic splash shield that is just held in place with some pop clips and 12mm bolts. Next thing we need to remove is this skid pan here. There's two 12mm bolts in the front and two in the back. So here's where my problem occurs in the front. The space between the subframe and the oil pan is very tight, so I'm not sure if the sway bar can sneak through this gap. Plus, I have the Fumoto oil drain valve installed on this side, which essentially closes the gap. So I either need to take this off and hope that this slides through, or I can undo the motor mounts and jack the motor up to open up this gap. But before we mess with that, I'm gonna disconnect the rest of the stuff, and then we can play around with that. The sway bar is connected to the end link with a 17mm nut. I'm gonna just use a socket and ratchet to see if I can break this free and get it off without having to mess with the stud. But if you do need to insert a hex key into the stud, it is a 6mm. For the sway bar mounts, there is a 12mm bolt up front and a 12mm nut on the back. I've got the sway bar disconnected from the car, and it seems as though there is enough space in this gap here for it to slide out. So I think we're just gonna have to remove the oil drain valve, which sucks because I just recently changed the oil, but we'll deal with it. And I think we also need to remove the intermediate pipe, which is the back section of the J-pipe. So we're gonna start there. Underneath the intermediate pipe, you're gonna see this brace here that's held in with 6 14mm bolts. So we're gonna zap those off and move this out of the way. A little bit further back and you're gonna see another 14mm bolt that is holding the intermediate pipe to the bracket on the transmission. Take the spring bolts for the cat back off next. It's a 14 and a 12. That leaves us with two 14mm nuts holding the front of the intermediate pipe in place. These are likely going to be on here pretty solid, so let's see what we can do. A breaker bar helps. So I'm actually going to take off this mounting bracket that's on the transmission, just to make things a little bit easier and get it out of the way. Just two 12mm bolts. Now we should be able to pull this off. Hopefully, maybe. There we go. We've got pretty much everything we need removed and out of the way. I did end up taking the Fumoto oil drain valve off and putting the stock plug in for now. And that should give us enough space in this gap here to take the OEM sway bar out. Let's give it a go. This does take a little bit of finesse. What you're gonna do is grab the sway bar and rotate it so the ends are pretty much as high as they'll go. And that allows you to drop the middle portion in this gap here. And you're also gonna take the sway bar and move it towards the passenger side. And that releases this side of the sway bar through this gap. And now you just have to work and angle the bar so it slides out from the gap, and we're good. The issue we're gonna run into when installing the new sway bar is that it is a little bit thicker than the stock sway bar. So we may have to just force it through this gap here. There we go. There we go. Okay, we did it. Scratched a little bit of paint off the bar, but I can deal with that. Again, we're gonna transfer over those metal mounting brackets and line them up on the studs on the back side, and then reuse the hardware that we took off. With both these sway bar mounts installed, we can reconnect the end link to the end of the sway bar. Now, like I mentioned before, this sway bar has two different mounting locations. We're gonna use the softer of the two, which is gonna be the hole that is furthest away from the sway bar mount. So if you're looking at it right here, it's the bottom hole. And that's the same for the rear sway bar as well. The hole that's furthest away from the mounting point is going to be the softest, and the hole that's closest is going to be the stiffest. So we're gonna reinstall the nuts onto the end link, and then we'll tighten these down. All right, guys, I've got the sway bar fully installed. Now I just have to reinstall all the parts that we took off, and then we're done. So I've been driving the car around for a little bit, and I can definitely notice a difference. Now, obviously, I'm not mobbing out on the street and pushing the car to its limit, but there is still a noticeable difference because these are much stiffer than the stock sway bars. The car just feels much more planted when you're cornering. It makes me want to take the car to the track again to compare it to the last time I took the car when it was essentially stock. Right now, the car is just sitting on some lowering springs that handle pretty similarly to the stock springs, but I think these sway bars paired up with a good set of coilovers would be the perfect combination. So maybe that's what we need to install next, some coilovers. But if you guys are interested in picking up a set of Race Comp Engineering sway bars. Check out the link down in the description. If you guys have any questions whatsoever, let me know in the comment section. I'm always happy to help. And if you guys are enjoying the content, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Give this video a thumbs up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.